Three, two, one. Hello, everybody. Welcome to another episode of the DevOps Insights Forum. The DevOps Insights Forum is a monthly open space for professionals to talk about software development, delivery, and reliability. My name is Sam Fell. We have a fantastic topic for you today: open source and DevOps. Open source software is everywhere. Many of us are using open source tools to build and operate our products. Even more of us have open source components included inside of the products and services we deliver. But how do organizations know which components are in use and what value they're getting? Join this panel as we discuss the opportunities and benefits of using open source, specific challenges for enterprise adoption, and how DevOps helps mitigate risks and overcome challenges. Super excited to be here. We have a fantastic panel of people. The great resignation is what they're calling it, but it's a great reshuffling because these are people that I know who have a ton of skill, a lot of knowledge, and some of you, the promotion may have said they were from a different place. They still have all that knowledge, but now they've got more knowledge. They're in a new place. I want to allow them to introduce themselves, and I'm going to start with my buddy Mitch Ashley. Hello.
Hey, Sam. Great to be here. Mitch Ashley. I'm principal with TechStrong Research. So I'm glad to be here talking about one of my favorite topics, open source.
Lovely. Great to see you here. Thank you. Brian Dawson, welcome to the program.
Hello, Sam. I think as you called out, I was recently at the Linux Foundation. I've now joined Ripple, a company that participates by providing participates in the community by providing an open source blockchain. And I'm excited to talk about that here.
Awesome. Us too. Thank you so much. Bruno.
Hey, everyone. Good to see some of you again. My name is Bruno. I'm a co-founder and chief strategy officer at Sumo Logic. Sumo Logic is a cloud-native observability and security platform, and we also have open source that we contribute as well as open source that we use.
Awesome. Tracy Miranda, welcome.
Thanks, Sam. Hey, everybody. I'm Tracy Miranda. I'm head of open source at a new startup called ChainGuard. And ChainGuard look to do software supply chain security.
Lovely. And Dave McAllister, welcome to the program.
Hi there. Thanks, Sam. I'm Dave McAllister. I'm the head for open source evangelism here at Nginx. Probably most of my listeners at least know what Nginx is. We're part of a larger company called F5. And as I like to say, I've been in open source longer than it's been called open source. I cut my teeth on Linux version 0.93 way back ways.
You know Richard Stallman.
I know Linus Torvalds.
This man has had some history going on. It's pretty impressive. We were talking a little bit before the panel started. Hopefully some of these stories will come out during the conversation. And with that, I want to sort of get into how this conversation is going to go. This is designed for all you folks out in the audience. These wonderful people with their cameras on have access to a microphone and a camera, but that's not the only way to communicate with us. You've got the chat. A lot of you have already put your information into the chat. I see them coming in, some folks from Chicago, from all over the place, which is fantastic. This is for you. Ask questions, answer the questions that we're asking. Be respectful, or we'll ask you to leave, and we won't ask you. We'll just drop you. And if there's any feedback, please share it with us. If there's something that we can do to help make this program more insightful or better for you, we want to know, right? We're all in this together. So let's warm that up. Let's see if the chat is working. If you haven't already, drop your name into the chat and let us know where you're dialing in from. And let's get started with looking at some of this data. One of the neat things about this program is we partner with TechStrong Research and the DevOps.com website, and they do a survey for us on topics that we care about. We meet a couple months before these programs. There's a lot of production that goes into this thing to try and figure out what some of those questions are. And one of the questions that we want to ask, and we've asked, I think 800 some people have responded on DevOps.com, but we want to ask the folks in this audience as well. So Cody, if you could pop up that first survey poll, whatever it's called. Where in your business is open source software being used? And you can click on as many of these as you want, right? So I'm going to go ahead and submit mine. Go ahead and submit. Let's see when we're going to get some of this data back. I'm interested to see, Mitch, what that data looks like from this cohort, from this group of folks that's on the webinar versus the 800 people that we had visiting DevOps.com, whether or not they have a similar sort of take.
I am too, because I bet there's a lot of open source we're using in our organizations that we don't even know about, right? It's in products and maybe even software we're building we don't know.
Exactly.
So we'll definitely compare results.
How are we doing, Cody?
That's looking. Yeah.
Would you like me to show the results on the screen?
Yes, sir.
Well, here they are.
Awesome. All right. So not a ton of other, but a lot of stuff in the applications that are being built in the infrastructure, the OS, the stack, or in the pipeline or the management tooling. Nice.
Mm-hmm.
Nice.
Let's have a look compared to our data.
37%, right? 37% for the applications. And wow, look at that.
There you go. We were able to ask a few other options too, and thank you to the DevOps.com participants who gave us their answers. But clearly, app dev and applications and infrastructure and the development process, you can kind of see it all filter down.
That's right.
Being the lowest responses in the 33% range for analytics.
That's
so
right.
Pretty widely used, and we probably could have created many other categories for open source, but I think these are the most familiar to most of us.
It's interesting, and Tracy, maybe you have an opinion on this, but the open source security tooling is interesting. I guess there's a lot more value for people from commercial security solutions. Is that why there's such a low sort of adoption rate of the security tooling?
Yeah, no, I think when it comes to security, while there is a lot in open source, part of the solution is also having somebody who can perhaps respond quickly, or the one throat to choke kind of idea of they need someone who they can get that responsiveness. So perhaps that leads to people going a lot with companies and in many cases proprietary solutions. But I do think that is something we'll see changing drastically over the coming year.
Interesting.
Oh, yes.
Yeah.
I think it's going to change drastically given what we've seen recently with Log4j. And I think that the formation of open security foundation is going to help drive some of that tooling aspects.
Yeah, very interesting. The Open Security Foundation. Yeah. Anything that we can do to help bring that knowledge together. It's one of the greatest things about the open source community is it's hard to compete with everybody, right? The innovation that can occur when everyone just wants to go do that, it's tough, which is pretty cool. But harnessing it, like you said, Tracy, making sure that there's a vendor behind it to support those folks who are using it, I think that's another important aspect. Brian.
Well, I was going to say there's an interesting thing here where Dave referenced Log4j. You brought up this question about really kind of what could be interpreted as an under response around security tooling. But when you bring open source and security together and you look at the fact that the highest response was we use it in applications we build. But then as you go down, that likely means it's in your infrastructure, even if you're not directly leveraging it, right? Applications are built or libraries are being used in your infrastructure, in your CI/CD pipeline. And I think as Log4j taught us, as well as, Heartbleed, is you may not identify here that you are using open source, but when it comes to understanding your security posture, you need to keep in mind that you likely have open source components in your stack, which ultimately represent critical dependencies. Yep. Like I think we said when we started the call, the real question is where in your business do you not use open source?
Yeah.
Think about OAuth and OpenID thing. I mean, there's all kinds of security software that's open source. I started using Snort and Nessus in the early 2000s. It's going way back, almost back to the Linux days, not quite, but yeah, it's been ever present. As you said, Brian, too, it's all over the stack of everything we're doing, right? Where isn't it?
Do we think that these are all going to move to the right and at the same pace? I mean, I definitely see that there's a lot more people putting open source into their applications than they are managing their infrastructure, managing their stuff with it. Is it just people aren't comfortable with it yet. The process is. I mean, I don't know. I'm just sort of.
My guess, looking at it, Sam, is there's some of them. Maybe the top 3 may see a little less movement. I think there's kind of a big footprint and presence in open source there, enabling vendors. But as you called out earlier, the security tooling, data analytics, I do believe we will see these shift right fairly rapidly.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Well, just think about open telemetry and how pervasive that's becoming, right? I
Right.
mean, very much in your wheelhouse.
Yes.
Huge
Yes.
growth.
So it's just left. We're shifting right now.
Exactly. That's right.
Right. So, yeah, open telemetry is going to be interesting. What do we do with the zettabytes of data, and how do we analyze them? So analytics are going to be pushing to the right, I think, a lot faster than we've seen previous growth. And in fact, I bet you if you went back 2 years, that analytics is going to be in the 15% range.
You think it's had a pretty heavy bump last couple of years?
Based on the number of places that ask for insights into data science around open source projects that I run into, there's a tremendous uptake for this, and it's also the powering element for AI ops.
Mm-hmm.
Without data, I'm sorry, your artificial intelligence is artificial.
Right.
So,
it's an empty car. It got no gas. Yeah.
Well, and would it be fair to say, I mean, I guess I'd throw out the team. Open telemetry, I think, is a great example of kind of what we saw earlier with CI/CD, and it's a problem that one commercial vendor cannot solve efficiently, right?
Yeah.
At least not in the way that's the best for the consumer.
That's transformed what we think about agents, right? Everything doesn't require an agent that does everything. Now we can specialize, right?
Mm-hmm.
It's really transformed this part of the business, the observability.
In general, yeah.
But can we get logging, please? Really, really, really quick, please.
We're working on it. We're
Working on it.
Yeah. All right. This is great. This is exactly why we wanted to change the format up a little bit. Thank you all for your insights. I appreciate that. And thanks all for those who are commenting in on the slide or playing along at home with the poll. So let's do another poll, Cody. Do you plan to increase, decrease, stay with the same use of open source? And this is the question we asked. I'm assuming, I'm going to lead the witness here. I'm assuming it's all going to head to the right. I mean, it's just going to continue to encroach upon.
We have confirmation bias in our audience.
Don't influence the poll, man.
Everybody vote how I said, or you'll all be kicked off. That's all.
Yes. By the way, we will be taking votes for open telemetry features. Just put that in the chat, by the way.
Right. Sure. Why not?
Just kidding. I'm just kidding.
Berlin, hello. All right. Let's see, Cody. How are we doing? Yeah. Pretty much everybody voted the way I told them to, which is good. Thanks, everybody. Appreciate that.
Take instruction well.
Yeah.
Great. 68 or 61, sorry, and 29.
Yeah. Let's see what the survey on the thing said. Yeah, same thing, right?
Right there.
Large percentage believes that that's going to be more and more and more. I don't know that we need to cover that again. And then what are some of the challenges that folks have with their open source software? So let's pop that up. So click all that apply, understanding where it exists. Oh, we can't click all that apply. So let's just click one. Click your worst one, the hardest one.
I'm excited to see the results of this.
Right? Yeah, me too. I'm going to go with this one. I'm not going to
be a little bit different than our poll results because you could.
I definitely have a bias here. I'm going to guess that there will be a heavy leaning of the first one, understanding where it's at.
That's always the challenge, is finding it all, very honestly.
All right,
and there are tools that can help you, but the tools also require that process in place to make sure that it's being done efficiently at the same point. So,
talent, securing it. Look at that! Wow, Tracy, we gotta have you talk more. Look at that.
Right on the heels of Log4j.
Yeah.
So it's actually interesting that the two, supporting OSS and operating OSS at enterprise scale, are both at 0.
Yeah.
That actually is kind of surprising in some ways.
Yeah.
There's some overlap between supporting OSS and training education.
Yeah.
I could imagine that some of that is being understood that way.
It's not
Yeah,
like a fortune cookie, so I can tell you what I voted and it won't ruin what I voted for. So I did say talent, training, and education because I think that that's the root of all of those things. If you educate people and you hire people who are talented and you give them training, then you're going to have security, you're going to have scalability, you're going to have all that stuff.
Yeah. Well,
Yeah.
and I would also call out, of course, hedging my bets. I'm biased, but so at the Linux Foundation, one of the things we were working on is a platform called LFX, and in speaking with members,
Yep.
As well as projects to an extent, one of the primary value propositions they saw in this LFX platform was its ability to give companies an organization-wide view of who is participating in and contributing to projects. And I think in a lot of ways, you can better secure, you can better train, you can better support, you can better scale if you know where and how you're using open source in your organization.
I think
So
that's
here we have the results. You could select multiple. So we see the rise of securing OSS right up there, right tucked under understanding where it exists.
Yeah, and that one actually fits. The operating OSS at enterprise scale is now up there, and that's always in my history of dealing with this from production environments. Open source is easy if it's on a single server. Scale to a few thousand servers and watch your hair start to fall out. Obviously, mine is still here, so I don't have to worry about that. But that's always been one of the challenges that I run into, especially when I'm talking about open source at scale projects. So nice to see that one moved up.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
And sorry, we closed those a little fast for some folks. If you have any comments, feel free to pop them in the chat. We're watching them. I'm monitoring it. I love seeing everyone say hello. It helps. It makes it more fun for us too. So don't feel bad about putting stuff in the chat. We love it.
So Bruno, since you're with Sumo, what is your feeling about the monitoring and observability question? Is that a confusion question around projects? I'm just curious.
So I think that a lot of this technology, why it's confusing is because there is monitoring observability open source technologies, and there is the concern of once you leverage it for mission critical workloads, then you've got to monitor it and observe it. So I think depending on how people interpreted the question, I would imagine that a lot of this is similar to securing it, right? When you secure something, you've got to apply a process and tooling to secure a technology. Same thing if you want to monitor it, right? You've got to figure out how to monitor it, what you need to extract, how to keep it running. And I would imagine that that's probably the bulk of this, rather than using it for observability / monitoring.
Cool, thanks. Glad for that insight. I'm also going to point out that the next to the bottom one, choosing the wrong project, and I'm also seeing a ramp up in this one. So again, history lesson. You wanted stories way back in 2000, starting in about 2003, and if you go all the way back 1993, there were these things called open source maturity models, and they were very popular ways of trying to determine how a project would fit into your environment or not for this. Come up to about 2009, and they kind of vanished because everybody understood open source. The last 3 years, that has become the hot topic again. Open source maturity models are all of a sudden new hot topics. Enterprises seem to be reaching out to look at this because they really want to know that the project they're getting into is going to meet all of their requirements and is not going to cause more headaches. I find that's an interesting cycle that's happening. And I think that's also representative of the fact that we're getting more enterprises into open source who would never have dreamed they were ever going to really touch it.
Yeah.
Dave, I wondered too, in that interim period, a lot of us use the kind of simple heuristics of, is the project active? Are people contributing? Are they keeping up with bug fix? Those kind of, heuristics. And that's not enough. That doesn't necessarily indicate you're getting stuff that's not going to get you in trouble.
Yeah. Yeah. The one that I use is like 22 items, and it's a pain to go find them all, but I can pretty much guarantee that once I've run a project through the process, I only use external sourcing. So I can only look at stuff outside in for this. I'm pretty comfortable whether the project's got longevity. And the big change that I'm seeing is now we have foundations driving this. So we now have Linux Foundation, we have CNCF, we have the CI or CI Foundation, CDE Foundation, sorry, for this, that are now driving this. So it's no longer what happens if the person goes away, what happens if the company goes away. The risk to a foundation disappearing is a lot smaller.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, Brian, do you want to comment on this, or Tracy? You both have been active in the CDF and Linux Foundation.
Yeah, I'm happy to speak to that, because I do think it is about giving folks confidence that the things that they adopt will stick around, but not only stick around, but like I think you have to be constantly asking yourself that question of, is this still a good solution to use? Because we have seen things change very quickly, and security is one of those things. So how quickly is that project going to respond to vulnerabilities? Do they have the support? Are the maintainers well funded? And it's such a tricky problem because it does cover so many different facets, from human problems to technology problems. So yeah, I think it's a definite evolution in the right direction.
Yeah, one of the simple questions that shows up and that most projects fail on is, do they publish their testing structures? How do I know what they're testing? And if I look at the projects, the ones that actually mention that they are doing, quote, they have a testing file, they usually go, we test the project. A former company once was having a bunch of QA errors before the project released. So the engineering team took it on themselves to go and just turn those tests off. So they passed, but it was the worst release in the history of that company for this. And so just knowing what they're testing will make me feel a lot more comfortable, at least.
Yeah, the dependency chains, it starts to become, well, log4j. Right. That's the example.
I mean, you could also look at the recent, and I'm sorry, I'm going to forget some details in my advancing age, but the color.js protest, right, where we talk about an open source application that's managed by a single developer. There's no governance or checks in, and the adoption and dependency on it is huge. Yes. And it just took one person to make one malicious commit.
You did warn us.
Yeah, go ahead.
You did warn us.
Yes, right. But to as trivial as it seems, right, that particular library seems really trivial, not business critical. But you know what? You bring it down, you affect business. So I do think this does speak to the power, and some people may debate it, but the power of some of the transparency, insights, and infrastructure that are Apache foundations and Linux foundations of the world provide to support what we're seeing in terms of open source adoption there.
Right. Fantastic. Well, we haven't even gotten into the panel discussion portion of
okay.
Which is so great. This is exactly why I did it this way, because I figured there was probably some good conversation just here, which is awesome. All right. And I understand it's the one thing I'm going to say here is the cost has never been really an issue. And I wonder if the way people were interpreting it is, free as in beer versus free as in puppy is a great expression that a friend of mine, Andy Mann, taught me a while ago. Free as in beer versus free as in puppy. So I wonder if people were thinking about the free as in puppy portion of the open source thing when they said that it is not a concern for them.
Not sure about that analogy.
No?
Yeah, a free beer can cost you a lot.
That's true. But a puppy will definitely cost you more.
Yeah, that definitely costs a lot.
Anything you need to share with us, Bruno?
Yeah.
No, maybe not.
All right. So let's get into it. So why open source? And where are people using it? I mean, we just sort of went through some of that panel conversation, but why should folks think about open source componentry and open source parts for their application? I'm going to mute myself because I got a phone call coming in. Sorry.
Well, if I can start, I think one of the things that I refer people to is that there's a massive amount of innovation happening in open source. And if you aren't taking advantage of it, your competitors are. I promise you that. So it is an opportunity for you to leverage a lot of investment that you're not making directly, and you'd be foolish not to take advantage of it. Understanding there are things that go with it. It's maybe as free as in puppy sometimes. But I think that's the whole cloud was built on open source. Let's be, clear about it. That's what really fueled the start of it, just as one example of an innovation.
Yeah. Yep.
Yeah, I'll jump in. I think the innovation is the primary benefit of open source. It's interesting to this question, where are we using it in our organization? And the question that the poll answered, I answered everywhere. I selected every choice because it truly is kind of where we have it. We have it at Sumo, in our application, in our tooling, in our infrastructure. We have it all over the place in our business systems. But what's interesting about that, and why I think we have it in our applications, and that's always the biggest bucket, is because of the nature of it. I think it's because developers find gaps in what they need. They fill those gaps. They realize that those gaps are probably present elsewhere as good sort of members of the community. They decide they can carve them off and make them solve problems elsewhere. And so that's why I think you're going to see always more open source being applied in where the developers are and less where the developers are not. But now, I didn't chime in on this during the poll, as we're kind of blending and developers become kings and all of the processes merge together, DevSecOps and all of these other things, developers are permeating almost all of these processes now than they didn't used to in the past. So in security, I think as traditional security and developers, collaborate to defend their applications and cloud workloads and all these things, you're going to see developers be more and more present inside of those non-traditional developer areas. And I think that's going to cause a lot more outcomes like we saw in general application componentry that's being open source permeate other aspects of technology stacks around an enterprise. So I think everything's going to shift right. And I think some of those areas where developers weren't en masse present in the past are now getting that presence, and that's going to cause more open source to be created. I think that's just my opinion. But
I like that. I mean, the idea that where there's more innovation happening, there would be more inclusion of that open source stuff. I also agree that there'd be more sort of developer persona, practitioner type personas doing that innovation. I wonder if people who are worrying about infrastructure today would contend that there's quite a bit of innovation happening on that side of things too. Maybe it's a developer who's pushing for that to occur.
You can't develop applications on top of infrastructure that's no
without
good.
Infrastructure, right?
So developers always had their hands in there.
There's
It's
some
automated. It's dynamic, right?
right. Yeah, but SRE maybe more SRE type developer, more operational focused. But yep, I totally see that as well.
I think one trend, like just over the years in open source, like when I used to work on it a long time ago, you'd spend a lot of time explaining to people what it was, and you'd spend a lot of time saying it's safe to use. Here's the licenses, and here's the things you need to worry about. And enterprises at the time, like you think of somewhere like the finance industry, you would see those as very skeptical of it, going, no, we're not allowed to use it. Our regulators won't allow us. And that over time has shifted so dramatically to the point where they're now going, not only we should be using open source and it's key to innovation, to actually having folks going, okay, here's our open source, everybody come and use it. Capital One has an open source platform. City have some open source. Just everybody's producing open source and putting it out for everyone else to use now, which is pretty remarkable.
Yeah.
But why is that? I would contend that Capital One did that because they wanted good developers.
They also wanted a competitive edge. Again, think about the amount of things you don't have to create yourself if you start with an open source base, and you have the ability to extend it in ways that are unique and useful for your own company.
But I think what Tracy was talking about was when they came up with, I can't remember the name of
Like
that.
Hygieia.
Hygieia, right? Which is an open source like monitoring thing that they came up with. That was like the hotness for a while at every DevOps show. People were talking about Hygieia, and Capital One was up there on stage with recruiting posters talking about how the developers were like, that was their thing. And that was awesome because that made infrastructure, that made that stuff exciting for the DevOps people.
It's a long game for talent.
It's a long game.
And, it's interesting you say that, Sam. I've had enterprise kind of quote unquote, relatively old, stodgy enterprise companies who would ask us year after year to present at our conference. And the rationale they would give me is, we want to attract talent. We want to show people that we're doing cool things. Please let us speak. We're like, all right, twist my arm.
Right.
Yeah. That still seems to be one of the biggest challenges, especially as we pointed out with things changing so much, is it's hard to find people if you don't appeal to what they want to do. The days of just, you're going to come in here and you're going to shift, the tape rack from tape A to tape B, showing my age again here. They now want to work on something that's cute, clever. They want to feel like they're making a difference.
An impact.
So, yeah. It's interesting kind of look at the correlation, or you'd almost say how open source principles mature to DevOps principles really have an impact on how you build, manage, and recruit for technical teams within commercial enterprises, right? You tend to see, like y'all said, people want to work in a non-hierarchical environment. They want to be able to bring innovation to bear. They want to work on something interesting. And now when we talk about the big, digital transformation, relying on the power of developers and technical talent, right? To your point, Dave, organizations are realizing or need to realize that the way they manage technical talent can benefit from following some open source principles.
Yeah. So in the chat, Sandra just put in this thing about a scary thing, or public cloud services, and that is kind of an interesting challenge. Back in 2017, there was an article that came out that said public clouds were killing open source, and in some ways, you can say yes, but you can also very honestly say, open source is powering the public cloud as well. But I'd love to hear the panel's discussion about how we, what the impact is. We've seen Elastic and the AWS change to OpenSearch. We've seen a lot of support on the OpenSearch side. So I'd love to get some opinions on that.
I'm gonna stop doing my job here. I'm just gonna let you do it from now on. You're perfect, man. Look at that. So teed it up just like perfect. I can't even imagine. All right.
And not only are the vendor lock-ins, back to Sandra's point here, real, right? Obviously, like the new Microsoft is AWS and all of that, but they're also using open source to get more people. Like, we'll host the open source project. It's the same thing. Just use it here. We support open source, and then once you get on, you get on. Much harder to get off. No doubt.
Yeah, but they do make it right because those open source components and those open source things are available pretty much everywhere, right? Kubernetes, right? I can run the workload kind of wherever I want to. There's some extra things that I can connect, right? If I want the extra special, the door to light up or whatever when I open the door, there's an extra API for that, and that's only available in one brand. Sorry, but that's the way it is.
Some of those for sure, Sam, but I would say that when you look deeper into kind of how some of these cloud vendors actually, specifically AWS, they go after those deeper projects. You don't see replicated elsewhere, right?
Right.
Kubernetes was one thing. They actually resisted Kubernetes for a while.
Yes.
And then they caved. But there are other things like specific databases and specific other open source projects that they are plugging into there as a service which is I think, to some degree, a strategic, sneaky way.
Yeah.
So they're putting a shim in between there's an Amazon API layer on top of the open source
Stop
stuff.
managing your open source yourself. Here it is. It's open source. Just use ours.
Mm-hmm.
So
Well, there's also the
ahead.
model of like Google building Kubernetes and a number of other things, Spinnaker, a whole bunch of open source projects that they turned to be public open source that really are matured well within the organization. I mean, they built it out of their own need, but you could argue that might have also been in their interest to help transform the industry.
Oh, yeah.
Cloud native use their services. So there's multiple interests in doing this, right? It's not all pure altruism or pure profit motive.
Right.
We could have 2-hour session just on that. You know, Google created a weapon to try to unjam Amazon's stronghold on developers early on, and Kubernetes was it, and it worked quite well actually to break those shackles. So I mean, as they fight amongst themselves, that frees us up from the chains too, right?
Yeah. There's a bit of out of that whole, Google, Kubernetes, Amazon, Microsoft story. There's a bit of the old adage, right? A rising tide lifts all ships. And we've all sort of benefited from it. I'll go back just commentary, to say I do think Kubernetes and CNCF as a body is a great example of when we talked about, left-hand side versus right-hand side, dev versus ops, built on the needs of public clouds, cloud native development. Kubernetes, I think, has really shifted the mindset of sort of operations and traditional operations side adoption of open source. It's had an insane impact on the industry, really.
Yeah.
But I'm gonna play devil's advocate. Kubernetes is great. I love it. We use it heavily for here, but it's actually gotten to the point where it's not approachable unless you're an expert.
Right, which goes back to what we were saying earlier: chain guard, right?
Right. It's the pleasant experience that Amazon and Google wrap it in that locks you into that open source engine, but all the gewgaws all around it. It's all the trappings that make it super easy for the developers, for anyone, except of course that easy becomes at a cost.
Yeah. And I think there's a big shift now in the industry to people going, okay, let's put the developer experience first. We need to take all these building blocks and we need to figure out how to make it something cohesive. And, at the moment, there's no off-the-shelf solution you can easily pick up, but lots of people trying to work out how to solve that for their own companies or for the wider world.
Mm-hmm.
If you're coming into the game and you decide, okay, Kubernetes is managed by the Cloud Native Compute Foundation, let me go see what other pieces I live around it and go look at the landscape, the 1,000+ possible companies, the, I think, 48 different categories of tooling that conclude both closed and open source solutions. And then you go a little crazy going, what the hell do I really need? So...
and I thought, Dave, I mean, of course, it's still kind of designed that to interact with it. It's an expert system. And I was going to say, hence, enter a whole new range of startups and companies focused around making it easier to adopt and use. But you're also calling out that the sheer size of the ecosystem is a challenge in and of itself. Yeah. Fair.
Daunting. Yeah. How do you choose which kind of rye bread is the right one for you, right?
Or what path through the forest? Or what path through the forest do I need to get from point A to point B? And when it was Kubernetes in July of 2015, it was one thing. If you look at, quote, the Kubernetes landscape of 2022, we've now got a forest that's 1,000+ acres, and we don't have paths.
All the variants of Kubernetes, right? Everybody has their own flavor now. Supposedly to make it easier, I think it's make the vendor's life easier.
Yeah, Dave, I've had to present and for people, if you go to the Kubernetes project or cncf.io, I believe it is, there's a big sort of landscape of all of the categories and components in CNCF. There's no way to fit that on a single slide and have it readable, which is
Yep.
Sam, are we in the panel portion yet?
We have not yet gotten to the panel portion. We're just sort of. It's kind of funny. I was thinking about this earlier. Imagine an open source panel where the community drives the whole panel, and I don't have to do anything, and that's kind of what's happening. So
I think it's on either chaos or autopilot or somewhere in between, Sam.
Yeah, I know, but this is exactly the conversation that I was hoping that we would be having, and hopefully the folks in the chat. I'm getting some good chat in there, which is good. So I'm assuming everything's fine. So we'll move on to the next question. Last question. What are the major challenges? What are some of the challenges that people are experiencing with open source? I mean, the problem, of course, is that our conversation has just covered all this stuff. We've just meandered around because the survey questions that we asked were too good. So
we'll take credit for it.
Yeah, exactly. So what are some of the challenges that folks in the chat? I want to hear from you. What are some of the things that you're experiencing as a challenge? 1 or 2 words. What are some of the things that you find challenging about open source? And let's see. I'll start. Tracy, let's start with you. What are you hearing that people are having challenges with?
Yeah, well, security is the top of the list, and I think it's interesting that for a long time the focus on security was always application security, and then we almost as an industry got so good at that the supply chain became the biggest vector for attack. So in the last year, we've seen a lot more supply chain security attacks. So that's the focus. I think if you get to the point where the White House is calling meetings on it and having to write executive orders, it's moving pretty seriously, and I think solutions in that space will be adopted really quick, and they have to be, frankly, because it is the biggest challenge.
Tracy, do you think that's specifically about open source as well as kind of the full software supply chain? Is there a focus on open source supply chain?
I personally think they're indistinguishable. If you're talking about supply chain security, software supply chain is open source because most applications, certainly modern applications, are using anywhere from 60 to 90% is open source. So I don't think there's a distinction.
We've passed that pinnacle over the hump. Interesting.
All right, Brian, you must have had lots of conversations with folks at the Linux Foundation. What are folks saying the challenges?
And as you call out, I may have a sliver on my bias. Well, first, I will call out that my entire career, I've sort of been at the seam between enterprise or commercial and open source, bringing in open source practices and tools, and the kind of top of that, the pinnacle was most recently here at the Linux Foundation, where I think I saw shade I saw through my entire career. It goes back to the answer in the survey question, just understanding where we're using it and how we're using it. And again, I think that leans into Tracy's answer where there's a challenge or a fear is with security. Look, we can figure out how to secure our software supply chain in terms of the practice of security practices, but until we know where it lives within our organizations, where it affects and impacts us, we won't ever be able to holistically secure our supply chain. So I do look really eagerly towards LFX, Dave, as we spoke about earlier, but also LFX collaboration with OpenSSF and XPDX, sort of your software bill of materials, right? We have to start to capture where is it showing up in our supply chain. Then we have to understand where are the vulnerabilities, and then we have to have a path to remediate those, right? And if we can solve those, collectively, we end up in a good place.
It's like the process that we had to go through to make our food organic. There's a supply chain that had to be certified for all the things that went into the water, the food, even before you had an animal, right? And that's kind of where we need to get to. And I think if we could get there, that would be fantastic, right? So I'm excited to hear about that software bill of material process or protocol, whatever it is that the Linux Foundation is putting together, because I think that would be very helpful. It's not an easy problem to solve. Those dependencies I was at Electric Cloud for a long time. We did release management. Release management is just a nightmare of a job if you don't have the right tools to help you do it correctly. And so being able to peel back the tin and see what's inside and know that it's organic.
Continuously. Oh, yeah. I'm sorry. I lost your metaphor. Pull back the tin and know that it's organic. I broke it. Sorry.
That's a really good point, because it's not just bill of materials that you start with. It's a continuous bill of materials. That's ongoing. That's changing any minute, every second, as soon as somebody does a new build, right?
That's right.
Yeah, and we hit a new challenge, just to throw in there. It's somewhat an extension of the open source conversation. But now when we talk about supply chain, we now also have to look at this other layer of kind of microservices as we promote. We are delivering applications that are built on a set of services that have been built across our organization. We have to track and manage those as a quasi bill of materials as well.
And who's using them?
Yeah.
Internally and externally. It's a big challenge.
Yep. So we lost our slides. There, somebody hit cameras because there's nothing. I don't think there's anything.
There you go. Is it back up now?
We're done. We got to the end.
Blame that on me, right, Sam?
I'll blame you, Brian.
Fair. Go.
I'll blame you. That's fine. So, folks in the audience, any questions for our panelists, for our esteemed guests on the panel? Ripple. Anyone want to know about Ripple?
The wine or the company?
Both. We can do it on one. We'll drink in the other.
Sorry, Brian. I didn't mean to do that to you.
No, I can't tell you much about the wine, though. My father told me stories. But yeah, no, I mean, I think it's very interesting in this conversation, because Ripple is a company that came out of open source creation of a cryptocurrency called XRP and a public ledger called XRPL. And it really leaned into the fintech space, again, an open source basis, but it was opening up the financial system on a global scale by better facilitating cross-border payments. And so again, you see sort of this open source base with both a commercial as well as altruistic interest. And when we look at the lineage, I will share, for those that are familiar with Hyperledger, you look at IBM's contribution of blockchain technology to open source, maybe almost akin to Google contributing Kubernetes. And Ripple has signed on to be a part of that movement. So for anybody that has questions about Ripple, feel free to ask. But also be aware that open source is a key part of making this new era of, however you feel about it, right? Cryptocurrency and blockchain technology possible.
Because Brian, it's open source, the technology, the underpinnings of that ledger. But is there can I use that with a different ledger also? Is there? So, well, there's a technical answer to that has to do with bridges and establishing supply chains for interoperability between ledgers. So short is there's a more detailed technical answer that says yes. Yeah. But in reality, you also can not only update and contribute to XRPL, but you literally can take and create your own private blockchains, similar to how you can with Hyperledger, and use it for whatever your desired purposes are. So that's the play. That's the play. Yeah. Yeah. So imagine that someone was using it for a software bill of materials to manage their supply chain within an enterprise, right? An immutable private blockchain. Nice. Very interesting. That's fascinating.
Yeah, Sam, I have a question for the panel and for the open source audience too. With the democratization of software, that term, and software coming from the bottom up, right? It's not always purchased from the C-level or the CIO down or whatever. And part of that sort of assessment by developers is, are you credible? Are you really an open source company? Do you really get it? Do you really believe it? Do you eat, live, sleep, etc.? Or are you just using it as a false flag to get in the door, if you will, just use the term that we're using right now? Is that still true? Do we still hold commercial companies to that same standard, or have we gotten to no, it's all it's all enterprise level, so we don't worry about that.
No.
Dave's
Sorry. This is you got me jumping up and down in my little soapbox here.
longer.
Yeah, so-
See how
so
you jump. No, I'm sorry. Go ahead.
I actually posed this question to 100 leaders in the open source community back a ways, and started with a topic that said, "Sorry, we're open." And at that point in time, I could identify 27 different uses of the word open compared to source, with all sorts of things, including my favorite, which was one company claiming that they were the open source leader because they provided the open surface that everybody wrote their projects on. We still hear this today, and it drives down into whether the community, I'm sorry, great companies, lots of money coming in here, but community powers open source. And so are you transparent? Do you show roadmaps? Do you accept suggestions that are coming in? Do you make it easily available and easily to integrate? I'm fighting an issue right now. I'm a Linux guy. Fighting an issue right now, whereas I want to put eBPF, extended Berkeley packet filtering, for a service mesh and I need to put the filter portion into the Linux kernel. But I have to meet specific guidelines that say you can dual license, and you can do BSD plus GPL or MIT plus GPL, or you can do GPL. But my code is Apache. I can't do that. Okay, so I either go through the headache of not only single licensing, dual licensing for a triple license on my code to be able to add something as simple as a packet filter. This makes life a challenge. So, literally hold the feet to the fires, including us. If you don't think we're being open enough, we want to know, because we really do care. We are founded on open source roots, and we really do care what our communities think.
Yeah, NGINX has, I don't know how many people out there hitting the NGINX stuff every day. It's like running the internet, basically.
Basically, we are the majority web server in the world right now. So it's not surprising, but honestly, it's still, I still look at companies and go, I'm sorry, you're not open source. Yes, I knew that person, and you are not that person.
That's right. And that's a bad look for companies that try, if you want to participate in the ecosystem, you have to really lean in, because they can sniff out fakes
a mile away.
Super easy. Yeah. Which is good, because it's built on people who are passionate about moving stuff forward, which is why it's so hard to compete with. My favorite, one of my favorite XKCD comics is the one about the 14 competing standards. And the people are like, oh, that's silly. We just need to have one standard that incorporates all those 14 standards. And then the next frame is there are 15 competing standards.
That's pretty accurate. I unfortunately did also have to deal with standards. I was head of standards and open source at one company, and we pushing PDF through the ISO process, and it's in separate organizations. 3 other companies proposed competing technologies to become standardized at that point in time. And we didn't want to be seen as bad guys by saying, no, that doesn't make any sense. It's done. So we just abstained as much as possible. But we went from one well-recognized standard, ISO 32000, to 4 competing standards, all trying to do the same thing. So it's actually real life.
That's right. Yeah, that is the problem. Try just having that conversation with my wife around how do you load the dishwasher, right? There's 2 competing standards right there. That's like the biggest one right there.
Yeah, and I think that is the challenge. That's how you get to those landscapes which have thousands and thousands of projects, because people can't agree or can't find a common way. So when it does actually happen, it's pretty magical if there's something that's good enough that can grow and can become de facto standard, or things like Kubernetes. I think those are always really exciting to follow and watch them grow.
Yeah, well, it's evolution is what this is. What we're watching is evolution, is that there are projects that are more favorable based on the environment that they find themselves in, and they have more access to resources, meaning developers who use them and put them places. And when she says that that's a project that I care about, then that drives that lineage. I mean, that's just sort of how it is. It's pretty cool. And the best technology should always win, but I don't know if it does always win. Evolution is not always fair, but it is always following the same rules that it always follows.
I know Dave talked about community being important in open source projects. It's also funny how important marketing actually is in driving open source awareness and adoption. If I may, I actually wanted to ask Tracy a question. Obviously, the topic of this panel is open source and DevOps. I know we've talked a lot about open source supporting DevOps pipelines, but Tracy and sort of building and leading the CDF. What's your take on actually applying more modern DevOps principles to creating open source projects? Did you see more and more projects adopting modern practices within the CDF?
Yes. Yeah. No, I think it is key. And I think projects are heading that way. I think sometimes it's harder to do when you have, just by the very nature of open source, you've got folks at different companies, different motivations, or in some cases volunteer. So you can't make a straight translation to some of the DevOps principles, but in general, at a high level, I think people were moving more towards saying, how can we get to a point where we're releasing more often, and we've got shorter feedback cycles, and what are all the things we need to do for that, which does include addressing the people problem. So I think that's been a major shift in the last few years.
Yeah. Nice. Well, this conversation, I'm sure, could sort of go on forever. We were having this conversation for 30 minutes before we started the panel, which was really great. So I really want to thank the folks. And Mitch, thank you for reminding me about the gift card winners. I will read those off. But I want to thank the panelists for joining us, for DevOps.com, for running our survey and getting all that information, and mostly for the audience for being here and participating in the chat. You know who you are. Thank you for joining the conversation. Cody, if we could capture the chat, that would be awesome. I'm going to read out some gift card winners right now. I'm hoping I'm not going to butcher your names. If I do, I'm going to apologize in advance. Pragya B gets an Amazon gift card. Nilesh P, Vlad B, and Artemis K. These are all some pretty cool sounding names. I hope I didn't say them incorrectly, but you've got money coming your way. So thanks everybody for joining us. Thank you, panelists. Thank you, Dave, for sitting in. It's really, really great to meet you. Your past, the history that you have, it's pretty exciting. We're really happy to have you join us. It's great. Everybody be well. Thanks for joining us, and we'll see you next month at another DevOps Insights Forum. Next month is next month reliability management? No, that's April. What is this one for sure? Cloud migration. We're talking cloud migration next time, which should be fantastic. Awesome. Thanks everybody. Be well.
You all.
Thank you.
Pleasure.
Bye.